Greetings, everyone, and welcome to We Are ACEDS live streaming on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. My name is Mike Quartararo. I'm the president of ACEDS. Today, we're going to be joined by David Gaskey, CEO and co-founder of Altumatim, an AI-based platform for discovery and investigations that is transforming how the legal profession approaches electronically stored information. You can learn more about Altumatim at altumatim.com. But David is also an intellectual property lawyer at Carson, Gaskey and Olds, just outside of Detroit. And as most everyone must know at this point, the world of artificial intelligence has sort of blown up in the media and changed the marketing Richter scale, I like to call it, to make a poor analogy. And I thought it would be useful to offer some perspective to our members and the legal community. Thus, our conversation with David today. David, thank you for making time to join us. Let's get into it a little bit. First of all, we didn't talk about this in our preparation call, but hey, tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to where you are today. Let's start there.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I'm co-founder and CEO at Altumatim. We started that journey a few years ago, and that actually grew out of my work as an IP attorney. Vasu, who's my co-founder, was a client of mine. I represented him in a copyright infringement case where he had written some complex software. And through the course of his case, he saw just how difficult it is for lawyers to really get that key information that they're looking for. And so after his case was done, that we decided to put our heads together and come up with something different. And that was the beginning of the journey of Altumatim. And my background previous to that, other than before being a lawyer, I studied electrical engineering. So it's all come together in a pretty interesting way, how your journey brings you to a certain point and all the pieces fall into place.
Awesome. All right, so let's talk a little bit. One of the interesting things about talking about someone who's got sort of exposure in the space, so to speak, is that, we bring you our unique perspectives and views. What do you make of all the hype that we're seeing related to artificial intelligence and specifically this notion of generative AI?
Yeah, it's interesting how, calling it hype, because people do seem to have such an extreme reaction one way or the other.
Yeah.
There's the people who are saying, oh my gosh, none of us are going to have jobs in 5 years. And there are others who say, don't touch this. I mean, like, for example, some of the insurance providers have put out statements to law firms saying, we don't want you to use this stuff. So there's really an extreme reaction both ways, depending on, who the person is or who you're talking to. I think some of it is understandable because it's exciting stuff. I mean, what has come out, the large language models have been around for a number of years.
Yes.
But once ChatGPT was released, when OpenAI put that out there, that really opened people's eyes to what's possible. So it is an exciting time.
Okay, but let me ask you this. So there's been some, I want to call them ridiculous, so let's just call them far-fetched for the sake of political correctness. There's been some claims out there, that AI is going to bring about the extinction of humanity. And I want to be clear, what's your take on the likelihood of that happening?
If people are irresponsible with it, maybe there's an increased likelihood that way. It just depends on what you allow it to do. I mean, for example, the generative AI, the large language models that everybody has become familiar with, they don't know anything. They're just following a pattern. I mean, they learn by example, and then they predict an outcome based on what they've seen before. And that's how they generate output, for example. So if it's just generating text or output, how is that ever going to be the extinction of humanity? If we put a model or a system in a decision-making role, like say controlling the power supply to your house, it would base a decision on whether to turn the power on or off on what it's learned before. And that could be problematic, depending on what it's been trained on and what it views as a good or acceptable use for electricity. you may find yourself in the middle of a blackout if a system is controlling that. So it depends on whether we give it actual decision-making power.
Right. And conditions
over a
may
system.
not conditions it may not necessarily control or know about.
Right.
You know,
Right.
A weather event could
Mhm.
could really skew the output, right?
Sure.
So,
Yeah. And if it's, what it's predicting as the correct outcome is based on something that we disagree with, then then yeah, that's a problem. So
yeah, not everybody's going to be happy.
but I think as long as they're not in control of actual machinery or systems, if it's just generating text, for example, I don't see that as a threat.
Yeah, and so let's talk a little bit about large language models. Let's unpack that a little bit, because there's varying sort of interpretations of what a large language model is, and I think it's really important that our listeners understand what an LLM is and what it does.
Sure. So without getting too deep into the weeds on auto regression and
Yeah, no,
transform
even for me, keep it high level
and
because I
vectors
don't.
and yeah, let's not get into that depth. But I mean, you can think of it this way. So computers don't read words; they just process numbers. Okay.
Right.
So a large language model, I mean, you can think of it as a couple of basic elements. There's a neural network, and then there's the transformer model. For the computer to operate, it converts letters or words into numbers, and then it can recognize what's going on with the large language models is it's got the ability to recognize a big chunk, like an entire paragraph, for example. So it converts all of those into numbers, and those are they're vectors, or embeddings is another term that you'll hear people use. And based on having enough of those, because it learns by example, it doesn't understand grammar, for example. There are no grammar rules provided to an LLM. It just sees example after example after example after example. And that gives it the ability to predict a next word or a next sentence. And the way that, for example, the GPT models generate text so prolifically is that the system, it can get into like a loop. So for example, you give it a prompt, you ask it to write a poem, and it'll start writing a few words, and then it'll take those words and predict the next word, and then the next, and then the next, and then the next. And it's all based on a statistical probability of what would be a good next word based on what it's seen before. And the reason why the models have gotten one of the reasons why they've gotten so good is the amount of data that they've been trained on. Because you feed it, like, for example, a ton of information off of the internet. It takes all of that and it generates parameters that then control how the neural network makes its decisions. And there's some sources say, for example, GPT-4 has 170 trillion parameters. So it's able to handle really complex thoughts or expressions, large paragraphs. Ask it a complicated question, you'll get a sophisticated answer. And that's because it's been trained on so much data.
But I want to be clear, David, we should not, what it's scraped from the internet, and anybody who's ever used the internet, I hope they know this, that not everything on the internet is accurate. So what does that say, and how do you control for that inaccuracy, misinformation, and does that explain some of the things like hallucinations that we've heard about in the media?
Yes, I think it does. I mean, there's a couple of aspects to your question. One is, if it's fed bad information, one of the basic rules of computers is garbage in, garbage out.
Right.
So if you're feeding it data that's inaccurate or skewed or whatever, that will affect the output because it generates output based on predicting what it has seen before. As far as how do you control that? There are different models that have different strengths and weaknesses. So like a GPT-4 is absolutely huge, but there are smaller models that are trained on a much tighter controlled data set. And so those are not going to have the same level of hallucination or a tendency to stray off into something that you don't expect it to do. So it depends on how the model is built effectively, what you give it for training. And then there's the whole prompt engineering part of it too, which is the way you prompt the system, the way you direct it to do what you want it to do has an effect on the output you would get.
Interesting. Okay, so one of the real reasons I wanted to have you on, because as an intellectual property lawyer, I wanted to sort of get your view on the intellectual property implications of AI, and specifically as relates to these generative AI solutions.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts around? And there's a couple of areas. There's obviously patents, there's copyrights, there's trademark, there's designs, trade secrets, all these things. Without giving any legal advice, and listeners, please, this is not legal advice. What are your thoughts about this? We've seen a couple of lawsuits, particularly in the copyright space.
Yeah.
What are the implications of this for intellectual property?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, a number of different areas of intellectual property. So starting with the copyright, because there are some pending lawsuits. There's been a couple of class actions filed against the owners of some of these models. Like, for example, Meta has been sued, OpenAI has been sued, I believe Google's been sued at this point. And the allegation there is that there was copyrighted material. Somebody wrote something and they have a copyright in it. And that material was taken, a copy was made, and that copy was used to train the model. So that's one aspect of it, is making an unauthorized copy of a work that's protected by copyright. That's copyright infringement by definition. So that's part of the cases. They're alleging that. It's interesting to me exactly how they're going to establish a class, because most class actions, the ability for somebody to bring a case, they have to have the appropriate rights. And in this case, you need a registered copyright to sue for copyright infringement. So I don't know if they're going to have to somehow gather everybody's copyright registration and present that to the court, or I'm not really sure what they're going to do with that aspect of the case, but that's an interesting twist to it to me. The other part of the copyright issues that are presented are what are called derivative works. So like you've written a book, for example, you own the copyright in that book. If somebody were to read your book and write something based on it, that's substantially similar, it's not a direct copy, but it's a derivative work. And what's being generated by these large language models, in many cases, is a derivative work. I mean, if it knows the lyrics to a song by pick your favorite artist, and you ask it to write a song of the same type, and it bases its song on those lyrics, then that would be a derivative work. So it definitely implicates some copyright issues. It'll be interesting to see how that all shakes out.
It's a fascinating area, but let me ask you a question, which I actually just thought of. What if the owner of one of these models bought a copy of the book and used it then?
When you purchase a copy of a book or a painting, you own that copy. You cannot make copies of it. There are certain exceptions to that. Like, for example, software. If you purchase software and you load it on your computer, you do have the ability to make a copy for backup purposes. So there are a few exceptions to that. But if they made a copy of a book they purchased and then use that for training data and then commercially exploit that, that to me strikes me as that would be a copy that's unauthorized.
Yeah, no, that's my sort of amateurish take on it as well.
Yeah.
All right.
Back in the day, how we used to make cassette tapes of songs, the mixtapes in the 80s.
A mixtape. Yeah.
Yeah. That was copyright infringement, technically. Yeah.
Yeah. No. And what was the song? The sharing platforms out there. Those.
Oh, Napster was the first one.
Yeah. Yep. Those were big. All right. So I think it's pretty clear that somehow, somewhere on the internet, some of these models are capturing copyrighted material. And I think you've talked about the copyright rules in this space. What do you think is the outcome here?
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, if you have a registered copyright and the infringement happens after your registration, you are entitled to statutory damages, and those can be substantial. So, I mean, just looking at it, from a purely, is there something here that constitutes an infringement? It certainly looks like it. What does the court do in terms of damages? How do they assess that? How do they allocate it? Is it every time that somebody prompts an LLM to generate a poem, which poem did it base its output on? I mean, there's going to be some issues on I think there's some burden of proof that the plaintiffs are going to have to overcome. How can they say, like, I took a quick look at one of the class action complaints, and it basically said every time this model generates an output, it's infringed all of these copyrights. Well, really? I mean, if you ask it to write computer code, how did that infringe somebody's poem? Those two one doesn't follow from the other.
Right.
So it'll be interesting exactly how the courts sort through what part of the training data is involved, or is it just because the training data includes some copyright material that they'll base it on that? I think those are some of the thorny issues that they're going to really have to figure out what to do.
Let me hit you with one more thorny issue, because this occurred to me when we were prepping. Is what about computer code? I imagine the only way that a large language model knows how to write code is because it's seen examples of code. So wouldn't the resulting code, if I went in and prompted one of these models to generate some code to create a program for whatever, isn't that in and of itself a copyright violation?
It depends on what code it would be based on. A lot of software code is open source, so you're free to use it under the open source license. So in that sense, there would not be an infringement, but you'd want to be careful what you're doing with that output to make sure you're abiding by the terms of the open source license. I did see a few instances where a model that was not trained on a specific programming language was able to write code in that language, even though it had not seen an example of that particular language, but it had seen code in other languages. That to me is really fascinating, that it could actually jump from one type of code it was trained on to another type of code. And that may have been because the people who were trying to do that were doing some really good prompting, and they really guided it to do the right thing. Maybe they gave it an example in their prompt for, like a piece of code, and then expand on that, for example. Not sure exactly how they did that, but that was pretty fascinating when I saw that.
Yeah, and I should share with our listeners too that prompting is the key here. You have to be really smart about what you ask these things, because if you ask it something dumb, it will give you a dumb answer. But if you ask a really smart, well-articulated, question, a really well-composed prompt will probably yield some pretty accurate results. It's fascinating to watch. All right, let's talk a little bit about Altumatim. Kind of taking things by storm a little bit. What is Altumatim? What does it do? How does it work? And how's it going?
Okay. So Altumatim it's a unique platform. I mean, we designed it with the intention of helping people find the most important information within their ESI. And one particular use case is for litigation. I mean, as an attorney who's tried cases before, every case boils down to a few important details.
Right.
It's really those top 10 documents, if you will. So how do we help people get to those documents as effectively and efficiently as possible? That's really what Altumatim's designed to do. And it does that based on learning the story that the attorney wants to tell, because whoever tells the best story wins.
Right.
So it's really a platform designed to help you get the best evidence to win your case. Or if it's an investigation, just to get the best evidence so that you get the right answer and you get it quickly.
Context is everything.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we've been able to take advantage of a number of different things. I mean, I think we've done a really good job of figuring out what technology does what well and use it for that purpose. Like, for example, we've been working with large language models for a couple of years, developing things. Mm-hmm. And they're good at some things, but not everything. So it's not like you just grab a large language model and just ask it a question and, hey, I've got the best answer. I mean, you're not going to get good results that way, and certainly not consistently. But figuring out what works well where, and then, piecing that together. It's the analogy Vasu likes to use is it's like we're chefs. There's all these ingredients out there. It's who puts the ingredients together in a way that just tastes delicious, right? And technology can be that way. You put it together really well, and it's just good.
I love the analogy. Reminds me of rubs that I create for a steak. So fascinating. And we're coming up on time, but I want to give you a chance. One to tell us if there's anything new and exciting that you want to announce. We love to break news here. Any big conferences, any big shows, any big demos, anything exciting happening for the company?
Yeah. Actually, a lot is going on. We're constantly developing and enjoying, coming up with new things all the time. But the big thing that we're about to release, and we're planning on having this ready for ILTACON, is what we're calling autonomous review. And what we're going to do with that is automate or streamline the model building and training process, and that tedious, document by document review. We're going to automate all of that so that you get a curated set of documents that are responsive to the request. So you can fulfill your discovery obligations much quicker, much more effectively, much more efficiently. And we're providing the ability it's going to be more defensible, really, than having human reviewers. So we're very, very excited about autonomous review and looking forward to revealing that at ILTACON.
So I've got to ask you, and this is not like hard news, we're not 60 Minutes here, but I've got to ask you, how does that compare and or relate to the sort of technology assisted review models and algorithms that are out there already? What's different, what's unique, and just so people understand the practical impact, what is the advantage?
Sure. So, I mean, it's several fold, actually. One thing is with the way that a lot of the TAR technology assisted review happens now, it requires a process of model building, which takes time, and which is dependent on people making really good decisions during that process. Because I look at that as a linear process. You're setting up this model and you're putting it on a trajectory. It's going to follow a straight line. If you have people involved in that who are making bad calls and something is or is not relevant or responsive, that sets the model on a trajectory that you can't recover from unless you go back to the beginning and start over. All of that is gone. You don't have to worry about that at all when it comes to autonomous review. In terms of relying on people to make decisions on is this responsive or not, and then not being able to know why they made that decision, that's gone as well, because we provide a report that tells you exactly why this document was found to be responsive or it wasn't. So in terms of defensibility, it's I think way ahead of even human review. The other thing about it is that it allows you to do this on a request by request basis. So like the model that I described, my understanding, a lot of large law firms, they build one model for the whole case.
Yeah.
Well, that's not very granular. If you can get down to a request by request level, which we do, way more precise, a lot more accuracy. So there's a lot of reason that we're very, very excited about it.
Fascinating stuff. One more quick follow-up, and that is, this does not remove human supervision.
Correct. No, we're not eliminating people. This isn't the hype that you're, the hysteria you were talking about at the beginning here.
Right.
No, I mean, it certainly, I mean, you could use it in a number of ways. It could be used as a quality control tool. It could be used, depending on the size of the matter and depending on who's involved and what time pressures they're under. It could be used in a number of different ways. But it certainly increases accuracy and increases defensibility. I think of it, we call it autonomous review. I think of autonomous vehicles. There's still a steering wheel. There's still a brake pedal. You're not on the road completely without any control. There's still human control and human verification involved.
I have, just from a personal perspective, I will not get in one of those unless there's a person sitting there. Sure. Who's ready to grab the wheel.
Yeah, right.
That's my take. So autonomous with human supervision is really what I like. Fantastic. David, fascinating conversation. Love to do it again sometime. Really quick, how should listeners get in touch if they're interested in checking out Altumatim?
Yeah, well, certainly our website, Altumatim, ALTUMATIM.com, and follow us on LinkedIn.
There you go. David, this has been great. Thanks so much for making time for us. Everybody, if you are interested in our short form interviews like this one, you can find We Are ACEDS live streams in your LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook feeds on our YouTube channel. And you can watch all our previous interviews there. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great day, everyone, and be kind to one another.